Across 5 Aprils by Irene Hunt. Day 8, Chapter 9. The deserters came in droves. The Point Prospect campground south of Rose Hill was said to be swarming with soldiers who made forays on chicken coops, pig pens, and smokehouses where winter meat was hung. In the spring and summer, vegetable gardens, cornfields, and fruit orchards were robbed. No one dared to approach the camp. Even the U.S. agents from the cities upstate appeared to be in no hurry for a visit. It was known that the deserters carried their arms and that they were desperate. For a neighbor to have recognized a face among them might well have been sufficient reason for getting a bullet between the eyes. These men meant to take no chances with an informer. The stories varied. Some said there were 100 men at Point Prospect. Others put the number at near 500. In the early months of '63, the theft of food was their only crime against the community. By March, however, a killing took place. There was a man known as Hig Phillips down in the southern part of the county, and the story came out that he had hired a substitute to go to war for him. That in itself was not uncommon. Many others in the county had taken advantage of this method of dodging the draft, which in the spring of '63 included men from 20 up to the age of 45. $300 was what it took. That was a lot of money, but once the substitute was found and the $300 paid, a man could sit back comfortably and yawn at the war news if he chose. There were men who were forced to take advantage of the system of substitute hiring because of serious illness in the home and the dependency of motherless children. There was, however, no reason why Hig Phillips should have avoided the draft except that he was a lazy bachelor much favored by his mother, and that he was fond of good food and a comfortable bed, and that had been known to adhere to the opinion that fools could do the fighting, while men of intelligence and property might take pleasure in the prospect of a long and easy life. He was not generally admired for these views, but that fact bothered him hardly at all. Hardly at all, that is, until one moonless night a band of young men visited him, men who knew that gangrenous wounds were like, what marches through cold rain or blistering heat meant, while hunger gnawed at their stomachs or weakness from typhus or dysentery brought agony to every step. Men who had seen the dead piled high on smoking battlefields and had come to believe that the soldier of 2 years had done his share, that the burden should now fall upon other shoulders. Although there were many who held Hig Phillips in contempt, his murder was an act of lawlessness that terrorized the county. People realized that anything could be expected from a mob of undisciplined desperados. Nancy, who had thought of going back to her own place the following summer, now heeded Ellen's advice and closed her house completely, bringing her stock up to Matt's new barn and keeping her children in the comparative safety of their grandfather's home. Jenny was no longer allowed to drive alone to Hidalgo for the mail. No one ventured far away from home after nightfall, and as in the days of the workman trouble the year before, no one ever went to bed with a full confidence of security. The fury of the abolitionists and the copperheads was now taken over by the deserters. One night in February of '63, as the family sat around the open fire, a wagon clattered down the road from the north and stopped in front of the house. Opening the door, Jethro saw 3 young men jump down from the wagon and stride up to the porch. "Is this the home of Matthew Creighton?" one of them asked. Jethro noticed the crispness of the voice, an upstate voice. He thought, "Yes, sir, my father's right here. Will you come indoors?" They came inside with a great clatter of heavy boots. Jenny stood wide-eyed beside her father's chair. Nancy and Ellen held the small boys tightly in their arms. Matt tried to rise. "Stay seated, sir. We're here to ask you a few questions." The young man who spoke threw back his coat to show his uniform and insignia. "We are representatives of the Federal Registers. We are charged with hunting down deserters from the United States Army." "Will you take chairs, gentlemen?" Matt said evenly, but Jethro noticed the sudden paleness of his father's face. "Thank you. No, we are here to inquire if this is the home of Ebenezer Karen, 17th Illinois Infantry, Army of Tennessee." "It is. This has been Eb's home since he was a lad of 10 years or so." "Have you seen him lately?" "Why, no. Him and my son Thomas left together for the Army in August of '61. My own boy was killed at Pittsburgh Landing. We ain't heard from Eb but once since then." "You know the penalty for shielding a deserter from the United States Army?" "I do. Are you telling me that Eb is a deserter?" "His commanding officer has reason to believe that he is, and that he has been making his way toward this part of the state. We assume toward his home." Matt lifted a shaking hand and covered his eyes. Jenny glanced at him anxiously and then suddenly blazed out at the questioner. "We haven't seen Eb. He's not here, and I thank you not to worry my father with more of this talk. If you want to look through this house—" "We do, miss. This house and all other buildings around here." Jenny grasped a kerosene lamp with a firm hand. "Jeff, you come with me. We'll show these soldiers through the house. They can hunt outside for themselves." Her anger made Jenny a very grand lady, Jethro thought. He had never seen her more beautiful than she was that night, with her cheeks flaming and her eyes large and black with mixed anger and fear. The soldiers grinned a little among themselves and followed her and Jethro to the sleeping rooms in the loft, then down to the kitchen and pantry where Jenny took down the big key to the smokehouse and handed it to one of the men. "We lock the smokehouse these nights. It's true there are deserters in these parts, and they're thieving around everywhere, but we're not shielding anyone. Go look in the smokehouse for yourselves. Go through the barn, the granary, everywhere you think someone might be hiding. And after that, I could say you'd best go down to the Point Prospect campground. The talk is that there are plenty of deserters there." The Federal Registrars looked uncomfortable. "Yes, we've heard," one of them muttered. Jenny nodded. "It is easier to come to a house and upset a sick old man and scared womenfolk. Nobody in this neighborhood thinks it's healthy to go down to Point Prospect, but you sounded so brave just now. I thought you might want to do your duty down there." The man who had done the questioning bowed mockingly before Jenny. "We'll see to our duty, miss, and if we find Ebenezer carrying on this place, we'll take him back with us. And maybe you too." He turned toward Jethro. "Will you get a lantern, young man, and light us out back?" Jethro took down the lantern that hung on the outside of the wall of the kitchen and started down the path toward the barn. The Federal Registrars followed, laughing with one another. One of them fell into step with Jethro after a time. "Is that girl your sister?" "Yes, sir." "Well, she's quite a little beauty." Jethro did not answer. His silence seemed to provoke the young man. "I said that your sister is quite a little beauty. Did you hear me?" "She spoke for," Jethro answered shortly. The young man shrugged and called out to the others. "I've just come upon some interesting information. The beautiful little Spitfire up at the ancestral mansion is spoke for." They laughed a great deal over that, and exaggerating the southern Illinois drawl and the backwoods diction, they made considerable sport over the boy's remark. Jethro felt his face burn with anger, but something new had been pointed up to him, something in the long process of learning to which he would be sensitive for the rest of his days. Until then, he had not thought of his speech as being subject to ridicule. The soldiers searched the place thoroughly and then started back to their wagon. One of them spoke sternly to Jethro on the way. "If this man Ebenezer Karen turns up, you know what to do?" "No, sir." "Then you'd better listen. You get word to the office of the Federal Registrars in Chicago right away, telling them where the man is or expects to be. You fail to report him, and you and your family will be to your necks in trouble. Do you understand?" Jethro nodded briefly. He was deeply antagonized by these men, but he knew they were simply carrying out a job assigned to them. Anyway, he was glad when the wagon carried them away, to the north. Evidently, they were not going down to the deserters' camp at Point Prospect. Not that night, anyway. There was an early spring that year. By the 1st of March, the weather was warm, and the higher fields were dry enough for plowing. Jethro carried a rifle with him when he went down to John's place to work. Ellen fretted a great deal about it, but Matt insisted. Jethro had learned how to handle a gun properly, and it was always possible that he might bring down some kind of wild game for the table, or that he would have need to defend himself against a desperate man. The field he plowed that day in early March was bordered on the east by dense woods, and Jethro became conscious that each time he approached the woods side of the field, the sharp harsh call of a wild turkey would sound out with a strange kind of insistence, almost as if some stupid bird demanded that he stop and listen. Once he had halted his team and walked a little distance toward the woods, the calls came furiously, one after the other. Then, when he returned to his team and moved toward the west, they stopped until he had made the round of the field. After several repetitions of this pattern, Jethro tethered his team and, taking up his rifle, walked into the woods. His heart beat fast as he walked, and his slim, brown hand clutching the rifle was wet with sweat. Ed Turner was giving him a day's help in the field across the road, but Jethro chose not to call him, although he had a guilty feeling that he was taking a foolish and dangerous chance. He walked slowly and carefully, pausing now and then to listen. The call stopped for a while, and he was half convinced that they had actually come from a wild bird. He made no move for a few minutes, and they began again, softer now, and more certainly coming from the throat of a man. Jethro stood quiet still. "Hello?" he finally called. "What is it you want of me?" There was no answer. Then the call came again, softly, insistently, from a clump of trees, one of which was a tremendous old oak, long since hollowed out, first by lightning and then by decay. Jethro walked closer, his gun raised, and after a minute the human voice which he had been half expecting to hear called out to him. "Put your gun down, Jeff. I ain't aimed to hurt you. I didn't just take the chance of Ed Turner hearing me call to you." He thought joyfully of Bill at first. He shouldn't have. Almost every night he heard his parents talking of Eb and what uncertainties they would face if he were really a deserter and if he should suddenly appear. But Jethro had forgotten Eb for the moment. The possibility of Bill's return was always a hope far back in his mind. "Who is it?" he asked again. "Come out and let me see your face." Then a skeleton came out from among the trees. It was the skeleton of a Union soldier. though the uniform it wore was so ragged and filthy it was difficult to identify. The sunken cheeks were covered with a thin scattering of fuzz. The hair was lank and matted. It fell over the skeleton's forehead and down into its eyes. The boy stared at it without speaking. "Jeff, you've growed past all believing. I've been watching you from fur off, and I couldn't get over it. How you've growed." Then Jethro realized who it was. "Eb?" he exclaimed, in a voice hardly above a whisper. "It's Eb, ain't it?" There was an utter despair in the soldier's voice. "Yes," he said, "I reckon it's Eb. What there's left of him." For a few seconds, Jethro forgot the federal registers and the fact that not only the word which preceded Eb, but his method of announcing himself gave credence to the suspicion that he was a deserter. But for those first few seconds, Jethro could only remember that this was Eb, a part of the family, the boy who had been close to Tom, the soldier who would have more vivid stories to tell of the war than ever a newspaper would be able to publish. He held out his hand. "Eb, it's good. It's so good to see you. Pa and Ma will be—" He stopped suddenly. He noticed that Eb ignored his outstretched hand. "Your pa and ma will be scared. That's what you mean, ain't it? Scared for themselves and ashamed of me." He paused for a second and then added defiantly, "I deserted, you know. I up and left old Abe's army of the United States." Jethro could only stare at his cousin. He could find no words. "Desertin' ain't a purty word to you, is it? Well, I done it. I don't just know why. We had another skirmish, and there was dead boys that we had to bury the next day, and we've been licked again. All at once I knowed I couldn't stand it no longer, and I just up and left. Once a man had left, he's done for. I've been a long time getting home, and now that I'm here, it ain't no comfort. Eb, couldn't you just come up to the house and see them for a few hours or so? Couldn't you have a good meal and get cleaned up and tell the folks all you know about Tom?" "Can't. I could get 'em into awful trouble. Besides, they would probably just as soon not set eyes on the likes of me again." "But, Eb, if you can't come up to the house, what did you come for?" Eb's face showed quick anger. "I come because I couldn't help myself, that's why. You don't know what it's like. You that was always the baby and head of the family. There be things that are too terrible to talk about, and you want to see the fields where you used to be happy. You want to smell the good air of old Illinois so much that you forget. You go crazy for an hour or so, and then you don't dare go back." He shivered and leaned back against a tree trunk, as if just talking had taken more strength than he had to spend. "Have you been down to Point Prospect camp?" Jethro asked after a while. "A couple days. It's worse than the war down there, with fellers afraid and getting meaner as they get more afraid. I didn't come back to be with soldiers anyway. I'm sick of soldiers, living and dead. Sick of them all of them." He threw himself down on a thick padding of dead leaves and motioned to Jethro to do the same. "I want you to tell me about 'em, Jeff. Uncle Matt and Aunt Ellen, Jenny. You knew Pa had a heart attack. He's not been himself. Ma's terrible, and Jenny's fine. We did the work of the farm together, Jenny and me. And John, Shad, where are they? They joined up, didn't they?" "Yes, John's in Tennessee under a general named Rosecrans, and Shad's in the east with the Army of the Potomac. He was at Antietam Creek and Fredericksburg. You heard of them two battles, didn't you? We hear precious little except what's happening in the part of the country we're in. I've heard of old Abe kicking out that fine McClellan. It's a pity you don't kick out a passel of 'em out in the west." Eb seemed absorbed in his angry thoughts for a while, then he looked up at Jethro again. "And Bill? Did you ever hear from him?" "Not a word," Jethro replied in a voice that was hardly audible. "I guess you took that hard. You was always a pet of Bill's. All of us took it hard. Your pa wrote Tom and me about it. Tom tried to pretend he didn't care, but I know he did. He cried once. I wouldn't let him that except now it's no matter." "No," Jethro agreed dully. "Now it's no matter." Eb took a dry twig and broke it up into a dozen pieces aimlessly. "How did you get the word about Tom?" he asked finally. "Dan Lawrence was home on sick leave. His pa brought him over. He told us all about it. I was at Pittsburgh Landing too, but I didn't know about Tom, not for 2 or 3 days. I wanted to write, but somehow I couldn't do it. Tom and me had been in swimming the day before the Rebs surprised us, and we was both of us in good spirits then, laughing and carrying on like we done in the old days back home. Somehow all the spirit in me has been gone ever since. I could stand things as long as I had Tom along with me." He ran his hand across his eyes as if to shut out a picture or a memory. "Tell me about little Jenny. Is she still in love with Shad Yale?" "More than ever, I guess. She writes to him a lot. He gets great store by her letters. He ought to. A man needs a girl's nice letters when he's suffering with homesick. I wished I'd had a girl like Jenny to write to me, but there ain't many such as her, I reckon." Jethro studied Eb's sunken cheeks and dull eyes. How do you manage to eat, Eb? I don't do it regular, that's sure. I live off the land, steal a little, shoot me a rabbit or squirrel, or cook 'em over a low fire late at night. It ain't good eating, but there's nothing good these days like it used to be. Jethro's inside twisted in sympathy. Are you hungry now, Eb? I'm always hungry. I'll get used to it after a while. Nancy picked me some grub to bring to the field with me. I'll go get it for you. He ran to the fence row where he had left 2 pieces of bread and the cuts from a particular tender haunch of beef that Nancy had wrapped in a white cloth for him. Ordinarily, he would have eaten the snack by mid-afternoon, but the wild turkey calls had made him forget it. He returned to Eb minutes later with food and a jug of water. They sat down together in the shadows while Eb ate, and with an appetite that was like a hungry animal's. Eb, I've got to tell you, Jethro said quietly after a while. The soldiers that call themselves the Federal Registrars was at the house looking for you last month. Eb seemed to shrink within himself. He looked at his hands carefully, as if he really cared about inspecting them, and his mouth worked in a strange, convulsive grimace. He wouldn't look at Jethro when he finally spoke. I was an awful fool. At least you got a chance in a battle. Maybe it's 1 in 100, but it's a chance. They say, this way I got none. There's no place on this earth for me to go. Even the camps of the deserters don't want fellers as weak and as sick as I am. They let me know that quick at Point Prospect. I'll either freeze or starve or be kitched. I'd give just about anything if I could walk back in my old outfit and pitch into the fighting again. Soldiers don't have to feel ashamed. Jethro sat for a while trying to think of some way out of the situation. It appeared more hopeless the more he thought. He was frightened for the despairing man in front of him, for himself and his family. When he finally spoke, he tried hard to sound reassuring, but the pounding of his heart made his voice shake. Well, you stay here till we can think of something, Eb. I'm going to get you some quilts and things from Nancy's place. I'll bring you what grub I can lay hands on. I can always get eggs and a chicken for you. I think you'd best eat all you can and rest for a spell. We'll think of what's to be done when we get you a little stronger. Eb looked up then. You all but fool me into believing that something can be done, Jeff, but I know better. You know, no one else can help me now, not even old Abe himself. Old Abe, Mr. Lincoln, Mr. President. I thought to go back to work now, Eb. I guess so. Eb looked at him with a suggestion of a smile. I can't get used to it, you being big enough to handle a team alone. You seem almost a man these days, Jeff. Even your hair ain't quite as yellow and curly as it used to be. Jethro turned away. I'll bring you a quilt from Nancy's before I go in for the night, he said shortly. He walked back to his waiting team. There was still time to plow a dozen furrows before sunset, and to think. He had faced sorrow when Bill left, and fear the night Guy Workman tried to pull him down from the wagon. He had felt a terrible emptiness the day Shadrach and John went away, and deeper anger the night he watched the barn burn at the hands of the county ruffians. But in his 11 years, he had never been faced with the responsibility of making a fearful decision like the one confronting him. The authority of the law loomed big in his mind, he remembered. You and your family will be in serious trouble. Loyalty to his brother Tom, and the many thousands who had fought to the last ditch at Pittsburgh Landing and Antietam, Fredericksburg, and all the other places were adding length to the long list. How could loyalty to these men be true if one were going to harbor and give comfort to a man who simply said, I quit? But on the other hand, how did one feel at night if he awoke and remembered, I'm the one that sent my cousin to his death? Eb was not a hero, certainly. Not now, anyway. People scorned the likes of Eb. Sure, so did Jethro, and yet, how do I know what I'd be like if I was sick and scared and hopeless? How does Ed Turner or Mr. Milton or any man know that ain't been there? We got to remember that Eb has been in battles for 2 years. Maybe he's been a hero in them battles. Maybe to go on being a hero in a war that has no end in sight is too much to ask. Sure, deep down in me, I want Eb to get out, to leave me free of feeling that I'm doing wrong to give him grub or taking the risk of keeping it a secret that he's here. Yes, it would leave me free if he'd just move on, but no, it wouldn't. I ain't going to be free when he moves on. I can't sit down to a table and forget that someone sick as Eb looks to be living off the land, that he's living scared like a wild animal that's been hunted. But what's it going to be like if more and more soldiers quit and go into the woods and leave the fighting to the ones that won't quit? What do you say to yourself when you remember that you fed and helped someone like Eb, and maybe you get a letter from the east that Shad is killed and you see Jenny grieving, or that John is killed and Nancy and her little boys is left all alone? How do you feel when things like that come up? Of course, right now I can say to Pa, I leave it up to you. And now what could he do? Why, he'd be caught in the same trap I'm in now. I'd wriggle out of it and leave the deciding to a sick old man? I'd put him in the spot where any way he decided would be bad, hurtful to a man's conscience. No, there ain't an answer that's any plainer to an old man than it is to me. And what was it that a man said the day of the barn raising? It's good that you're a boy. You don't have to worry yourself about this war. Why, yes, no doubt about it, 11 years old boys ain't got a thing to worry about. This year of 1863 is a fine, carefree time for 11-year-old boys. Jenny noticed his preoccupation at supper that night. She waited until the others were out of the kitchen, and she and Jethro were left alone. What is it that's on your mind, Jeff? Nothing. He's just tired. He threw himself down in front of the fireplace and closed his eyes. He knew it would be hard to deceive his sister. There was a determination about Jenny. You better tell me, Jeff. I'll find out, you know. You don't give me any worry. There's nothing to find out. Jeff, have you had some news about Shadow, John? No, how could I? You know what mail's come. You might have talked to someone. Well, I ain't. Not to anyone that knows a word about Shadow John. She worked at her dishpan for a while in silence. Then she walked over and poked him a little with the toe of her shoe. There's something, Jeff. Nancy noticed it too. Now I want to know, is it something about Eb? Is he here with the deserters? He turned his head away from her. He couldn't remember when he had lied to Jenny, and he wasn't sure that he could do it well. Jenny, you vex me when I'm not feeling so well. Can't I have an upset stomach without you firing a passel of questions at me? She stood looking down at him thoughtfully for a while, and then an idea stemming from experience with older brothers suddenly struck her. She dropped down beside him and whispered her suspicion gleefully in his ear. Jeff Creighton, have you been smoking on the sly? Is that what's giving you an upset stomach? He kept his eyes closed and did not answer. No one in silence would confirm her guess. Jenny was triumphant. That's it. I know without your saying it, she crowed. You look white the way Tom and Eb did once when they tried it. It was very simple to lie without words. He merely opened his eyes and grinned sheepishly at her. I'm surprised you would be that silly, Jeff. With so much spring work to do, you don't have the time to get sick over smoking. She shook her head. How do you expect to keep going when you didn't more than touch your meal tonight? He seized the opportunity to get some food for Eb without detection. Will you fix me a little bread and meat and slip it up to my room later on, Jenny? I'll likely feel better after a while, and I'm going to be hungry when I do. She sighed, but with a certain satisfaction. There was an adventurous streak in Jenny. She would have liked to try smoking herself if she had dared, and she was a little amused that her sober young brother had been tempted in this direction of most young males. Jethro lay awake in his room that night and wrestled with his problem. He wondered if, after all, it wouldn't be better to ask his father's advice. But he decided against it almost immediately and as firmly as he had rejected the idea that afternoon. He wondered about Ross Melton, but there was little chance to make a trip to Newton at this time of year. What about Eb Turner, staunch, level-headed neighbor? No, Ed had 2 sons in the Army. It wouldn't do to lay this responsibility upon Ed's shoulders. I thought about Eb's words. You nor no one else can help me now, not even old Abe himself. Old Abe, Mr. Lincoln, Mr. President. Not even Mr. Lincoln himself. Jethro turned restlessly in his bed. What if one put it up to Mr. Lincoln? What if one said, I will abide by the word of him who is the highest in this land? But wasn't that word already known? Wasn't the word from the highest in the land just this? Turn in deserters, or there will be terrible trouble for you and your family? But Mr. Lincoln was a man who looked at problems from all sides. Mr. Lincoln was not a faraway man like General McClellan or Senator Sumner or Secretary of State Seward. Mr. Lincoln had plowed fields in Illinois. He had thought of the problems men came up against. He was not ready to say, everything on this side of the line is right and everything on the other side is wrong. But would one dare? Nobody, a boy on a southern Illinois farm, would he dare? Mr. Lincoln held the highest office in the land. What would he think? Would it vex him that a boy from southern Illinois could be so bold? And anyway, how could one say it? What manner of words could one use so as not to be too forward, too lacking in respect toward the President of the United States? Jeff realized he was not going to be able to go to sleep. There was a candle in his room. There was some ink and an old pen that Bill had sometimes used. There was also Ross Milton's book, the book on English usage. Jethro got up in the quiet of the night, lighted his candle, opened Ross Milton's book, and began to write on a piece of rough-lined paper. The next morning he hid Jenny's sandwiches inside his coat, and at the barn he picked up a few eggs from the nest up in the loft. He dug an apple out of the straw in the apple cave. No one would question that. A boy needed something to munch on in mid-morning. He would like to have taken some coffee beans. A man lying out in the woods all night needed a hot drink, but that item was one he would not take. Not for Eb. Not even for Bill or Shad would he have taken his mother's coffee. He knew where there were good sassafras roots in the woods. Maybe he would burn some brush in the fence rows and heat a little water for sassafras tea. He filched an old kettle and 2 lumps of sugar, just in case. Eb was feeling a little better that morning. The quilts Jethro had taken from Nancy's house had made the long night more comfortable. He had washed himself in the creek and looked refreshed. "You brung me a feast, Jeff," he said gratefully. They sat together for a while and talked in low voices. "I'll be getting out in a day or so, Jeff. I can't have you taking all this risk. If you could go back to the army, would you? Wouldn't you, Eb? You're asking a man if he had a chance to live. Would he take it? But I've told you, Jeff, the deserter can't go back. I'll be hunted the rest of my days, but the rest of my days ain't going to be too many." Jethro said nothing, but as he plowed that morning, he made up his mind to send the letter. It was a frightening thing to do, but if one did nothing, well, that was frightening too. He knew Eb was not really planning to leave. Eb was a lost and frightened boy, and there was nowhere else to go. For Jethro, there was nothing to do but send the letter. The plowshares needed sharpening. Jethro told his father that noon. Hadn't he better drive over to Hidalgo and get that work done? He picked up the mail, too, for themselves and for Ed Turner. Was that all right with his father? Matt seldom questioned Jethro's decisions. The boy was doing a man's work. He was due the dignity accorded to a man. Matt assented to the trip readily, and Jethro, with the letter in his pocket, drove off down the road, his heart pounding with excitement. In Hidalgo, the old man who took care of the mail glanced sharply at Jethro when he noticed the inscription on the envelope. But he was a silent man with problems of his own. As long as a letter was promptly stamped and addressed, it was no affair of his. Privately, he thought that some people were allowing their young'uns to become a little forward, but that was their concern. He threw Jethro's letter in a big bag that would be taken by wagon down to Olney that evening. The long wait for an answer was interminable. Jethro tossed at night and wondered, had he done an impudent thing? Had he laid himself open to trouble? Had he been a fool to think that a boy of his age might act without the advice of his elders? Sometimes he got up and walked about his narrow room, but that was bad, for Jenny would hear him. Once she came to his door, and she was crying. "Jeth? Jeth, what is it? What's bothering you? Ain't we good friends any more? Ain't you going to tell me?" He had to be curt with her to forestall any more questions. After that, she didn't come to his door again, but he knew that if he stirred or moaned under his burden of worry, both Jenny and Nancy would hear him and worry through a sleepless night. Ebbs often reiterated, "I'll be going on soon, Jeff. I won't be a burden to you much longer," became like a whippoorwill's cry, always the same and never-ending. Jethro closed his ears to it, but the tensions within him mounted, and the necessity of providing for Ebb's needs in strictest secrecy became a task that seemed to grow in magnitude as the days went by. "If I could be sure I'm doing the right thing," he was saying to himself as he watched the dark earth fall away from his plowshares. "If I could feel really set up about doing a fine thing, but I don't. Maybe I'm doing something terrible wrong. Maybe the next time they come, the Federal Registers will take me." The letter came one noon when they were all seated at dinner. As so often happened, it was Ed Turner who brought the mail out from town. Jenny ran to the door, eager for a letter from Shadrach. Nancy's eyes pleaded for a word from John. But Ed held only one large envelope, and that was addressed to Jethro in a small, cramped handwriting done in very black ink. It was postmarked Washington, D.C. "Looks like a pretty important mail you're getting, Jethro," Ed said quietly. His eyes were full of puzzled concern. Jethro's head swam. This was the showdown. Now, and all the family, Ed Turner, and soon the neighborhood, would know everything. In the few seconds that passed before he opened the envelope, he wished with all his heart that he had not meddled in the affairs of a county or country at war, that he had let Eb work out his own problems, and that he, Jethro, were still a sheltered young boy who did the task his father set for him and shunned the idea that he dare think for himself. He looked at the faces around him, and they spun in a strange mist of color. Black eyes and blue eyes, gray hair and golden black, pink cheeks and pale ones, and weather-beaten brown ones. He read the letter through, word for word, and while he read, there wasn't a sound in the cabin beyond the slight rustle of the page and the shaking hand that held it. When he was through, he held the letter out to Jenny with a long sigh. "You can read it out loud, Jenny." Jenny stared at him as if he were a stranger. Then she shook her head. "It's your letter, Jeff. You'd best do the reading." He didn't know whether he could or not. There was a great pounding in his ears, and his breath was short, but he ran his hand across his eyes and swallowed hard. After the first few words, his voice grew steady, and he read the letter through without faltering. Executive Mansion, March 14, 1863. Master Jethro Creighton, Hidalgo, Illinois. Dear Jethro, Mr. Hay has called my attention to your letter, knowing as he does the place in my affection for boys of your age and the interest I have in letters coming from my home state of Illinois. The problem which you describe is one among so many others that has troubled both my waking thoughts and those that intrude upon my sleep. The gravity of that problem has become of far-reaching significance, and is one in which the authority of military regulations, the decline of moral responsibility, and the question of ordinary human compassion are so involved as to present a situation in which a solution becomes agonizingly difficult. I had, however, made a decision relative to this problem only a few days before receiving your letter. There will be much criticism of that decision, but you will understand when I say, if it be a wrong one, I have then erred on the side of mercy. The conditions of that decision are as follows. All soldiers improperly absent from their posts, who will report at certain points designated by local recruit offices by April 1st, will be restored to their respective regiments without punishment except for forfeiture of pay and allowances for the period of their absence. This information you may relay to the young man in question, and I pray that the remorse and despair which he has known since the time of his desertion will bring his better self to the cause for which so many of his young compatriots have laid down their lives. May God bless you for the earnestness with which you have tried to seek out what is right. May he guide both of us in that search during the days ahead of us. Yours, very sincerely and respectfully, Abraham Lincoln.